So what I'm doing, I'm recording the notes back from the yes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Hennessy. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to a very special Mile End group this evening. Dennis Healey on being Chancellor. Somebody's already accused the Mile End group of organising the economic indicators today, just to give Dennis the kind of cue that he relishes. And though the Mile End group has a certain reach, it ain't that powerful. But it's a great pleasure to introduce Dennis this evening. Bill Keegan is with me. Bill and I first knew Dennis as journalists, and in my case, long ago and far away, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1970s. Bill, I think, has known him even longer than that. Now, interviewing Dennis was the nearest we came to playing in a cup final. Dennis has a combination of brilliance, jollity, and downright aggression, which makes him like no other. Particularly as all those characteristics were and are overlain by a kind of affection. And I'm sure we'll see them all displayed this evening. In both his cabinet jobs, Defence 1964 to 70, the Treasury 1974 to 79, Dennis was a toughie, a sticker, who bashed through seemingly permanent upheavals. At Defence, for example, he was engaged in what, looking back, seems to me to be a perpetual defence review. And his chancellorship began with an oil price explosion and finished with an oil price explosion, and in between came the International Monetary Fund crisis of the autumn and early winter of 1976, which remains of huge interest to we historians. Now, the drill this evening is as follows. Dennis will speak for 10 minutes, then Bill and I will chat with Dennis, questions and so on, for another 10 to 15 minutes. Then it's open house, then we go downstairs for a drink. Dennis, you're hugely welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, it is, of course, a great honour for me to be talking to you all tonight, but even more, it's an enormous pleasure because I have so many old friends in the audience. Hans Ambros, for example, with whom I worked very closely when he was his country's Chancellor. Joe Barnett, who was one of my colleagues who always told me off when I got it wrong. Quite often, actually, never stopped talking. But it's a very odd job being Chancellor. The first Chancellor I know of was Richard, son of Nigel, not you, actually, 1,000 years earlier. But he once wrote in Latin, which I'll put it in English, the job of a Chancellor requires two great skills, and although one is adding up the figures, the really important one is judgment. And that, of course, is absolutely true. Apart from anything else, the figures are so often wrong. And when I was Chancellor, they were nearly always wrong. When I was Chancellor, the basis on which you worked was the forecast of the public sector borrowing requirement, which was the gap between the amount of money you get in revenue from taxes and so on, and the amount you spent. And in my period, I was always told lies, honest lies, that people had not the slightest idea they were wrong. but the public sector borrowing requirement for my 2 years was £2 billion too high, which was quite a lot of money in those days. And then the next year, £1 billion too low. And so I never needed to have gone to the IMF if I'd had the accurate figures. But fortunately, I only drew half of the money which they offered me, and I paid it all back before I left office. Indeed, oddly enough, not only was I chairman of the interim committee, the national executive, if you like, the executive committee of the IMF, I was offered the job of running the IMF as manager when Vitamin retired, but I refused because I didn't want to be an international civil servant, which is even worse, I think, in many ways, than being a national civil servant. And same reason I refused after being Secretary of State for Defence to take the Secretary General of NATO's job. The biggest single mistake, I think, in figures I got was the deficit of the British Petroleum, which was 5% of GDP in my last year, and made life very difficult indeed. Nevertheless, I did manage to get the retail price index down from 26% to 12.9%, roughly half, during my period of office, largely through the enormous assistance I got from the leaders of the TUC at the time, the so-called terrible twins, Jack Jones and Hugh Scanlon, and of course Len Murray, who had been a colleague of mine when I was working as an official, as an apparatchik at Transport House like him. But it was a very, very different job in those days than it is now, because globalization has completely changed the nature of the world economy, and of course has also changed the way in which your own economy works, in ways in which it's often quite impossible to forecast, because money can nowadays, because of information technology, be moved from London to Peking to Washington and back to London in microseconds, and it is extremely difficult because in my time, for example, the retail price index was largely determined by the union balance, although when we introduced one man, one vote, the power of the balance was destroyed, and the importance of the unions in the economy was therefore pretty well wiped out, and the unions have never recovered from that. What I think is difficult now and not easy to deal with at all is the result of globalization and information technology on both spending and prices. And I think to be Chancellor of the Exchequer now is a very, very much more difficult job than it was in earlier times. And of course it's not only now what the Americans and the Europeans do, what the Asians do, and particularly the Chinese, has become equally important. So I must say, although in the end I quite enjoyed my job as Chancellor, although it was an extremely painful and difficult one, I think to have it nowadays is almost must be intolerable. And I feel very sorry for the present Chancellor of the Exchequer, despite his politics and character. And so, as I say, it's very, very difficult now to forecast what's going to happen to the economy and therefore what you should do yourself. But now I will take questions and answer or evade them, whichever seems more suitable.
Thank you, Dennis. We call this being Chancellor, but being Shadow Chancellor is quite topical at the moment.
Yeah.
And you were Shadow Chancellor. I mean, your life seemed to have been devoted to becoming Foreign Secretary, but you went, when Roy Jenkins resigned in April '72 over Europe, you suddenly went from being Shadow Foreign Secretary to Shadow Chancellor.
That's right.
And am I right in thinking you hadn't devoted much interest, much attention to the economy in the city?
Absolutely none at all. I knew nothing about economics. But of course, once I was in the job and doing it, I discovered the economics is not a science. It's just a branch of social psychology. Because what happens in the economy is now almost impossible to forecast because it's determined by so many people over whom you have no influence whatever. The population of China, the population of Japan, Latin America. It's a very, very difficult and different job from what it was in my time, and I've been a great deal of sympathy with the people who hold it nowadays.
So you've got some advice for Ed Balls? Have you got some advice for Ed Balls, who's just assumed Shadow Chancellor?
Not really. He's a very intelligent man in my opinion, and I've known his wife since she was a pretty young thing about 30 years ago. No, thank God. But it is, as I say, it's a totally different job from what it was in my time, and very, very much more difficult to do, because you have no control over the people who affect your prices.
Now, Joel Barnett, who's here, who's your Chief Secretary, in his book, he said that he got more and more depressed at things like the Honourable Treasury, but you were eternally optimistic, he said.
Well, on the whole, my optimism turned out to be justified because the projections, the forecasts for the PSBR were always wrong. And as I say, I managed to spend nearly half of the money the IMF lent me and paid it all back before I left office.
I seem to remember you had an expression in the Treasury for the time when that would come, when the IMF, you no longer need the IMF.
Sod off.
Yeah.
Well, it's better than sod on, which is more democratic, actually.
You also, Dennis, anticipated the coming on stream of North Sea Oil, and you wanted to be there to pick the cherries, I think was your phrase.
Yes, that's right.
Do you not think, looking back, although the oil flowed after you'd gone, after you lost office in '79, that we wasted that bonanza?
I think we did really, and I think this was in many ways Mrs. Thatcher, she then was, her greatest single error, because it provided 5% of our GDP at that time, and she just wasted it.
You've talked about the IMF, and you wouldn't have had to have gone cap in hand if you'd had accurate statistics forecasts. I mean, I remember that time you said you wanted to do for the economic forecasters what the Boston Strangler had done for door-to-door sales.
Yes, and well, I did so.
You did. But looking at the way the world was even then, looking at the world the way it was even then in terms of volatility of markets, the markets were losing confidence in the UK economy. They really were, in terms of your capacity to borrow long and all the rest of it. And even if the statistics had been more accurate, do you not think the market really had taken a judgment against you and Jim Callaghan, and that something had to be done to assuage it?
I think they had, actually. And of course I had to face that fact and adjust my policy accordingly, which I did.
Do you think those markets suddenly discovered North Sea oil? I remember vividly, I was at the Bank of England at the time, but there was all that disastrous period, and then suddenly, in 1977, they discovered, the markets noticed North Sea oil, and the pound went up, and you went from trying to defend it to wondering whether you could stop it rising.
That's right, yes. But that's typical of the way the economy works, isn't it?
Can I ask you about that last of the IMF cabinets? I think there were 9 full cabinets on it. It's inconceivable now that you'd have time to have 9 full cabinets. There's other members of Jim's cabinet here. But did you ever think, as some have suggested, that until the last moment when Jim backed you and Joel, that you might not get it through and the government might crumble?
I was very worried about that, yes. But I must say, I think the union leaders were so helpful at that time. They made a colossal difference to what was going on. And I think my relationship with them was probably one of the most important single factors in my success.
And your relationship with Jim, it was strained a bit, but it was all right in the end.
Yes, it was. He'd been Chancellor, of course, himself, but the great thing with Jim is he was a very pragmatic person, and he watched carefully what was happening and adjusted policy accordingly, so that when he saw that he was wrong and I was right, he didn't worry him too much.
Talking of Jim, Dennis, I think you used to say that you didn't really want to be Prime Minister, even though you stood for the leadership succession to Harold Wilson in April 76. But have you changed your mind about that?
Yes, I have. I mean, at that time, I actually said, because I thought it, that I would rather do something than be something. And Chancellor does something, a Foreign Secretary does something, but I thought a Prime Minister just was a Prime Minister. But now, of course, I realise that the Prime Minister job, if he's a good one, is very, very important indeed, as it was when Jim was Prime Minister and supported me, so that I now rather wish I'd gone in for that. But
do you think you'd have done it well, Dennis?
It would have depended very much on circumstances, as you know, but I think I was well qualified for it at that time, and I personally now regret that I didn't go for it.
Didn't you suggest in your memoirs that it might just have been possible that Labour would not have been out for so long, and Mrs Thatcher might not have been re-elected as Prime Minister?
Leader.
I think it is.
Leader, sorry.
I do think that. I do think that. Yes.
And then, after the chancellorship, I imagine the tussle with Tony Benn for deputy leadership must have been, the result must have been one of your proudest moments.
Well, it was one of my most anxious moments because, as you only know, I only won by a hair of my eyebrow, under 1% majority. Yeah. But if the Transport and General Workers Union had voted as its members wanted, as we discovered later, I'd have had a majority of several million. But that was life in the party at that time.
Well, Bill, should we open it up?
Yes.
Can I see a hand?
We have many people, some people who worked with you.
Yes.
Yes, hello.
The microphone's coming, actually.
David.
That's it.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Dennis, a question about Europe.
Did you say who you are?
Yes, David Marsh.
Who are you, David Marsh?
Yes, exactly. We know.
Yes, I dabble in lots of things. It's a question about European monetary affairs. We all remember Manfred Lahnstein, who would have liked to have been here tonight, but he's off somewhere. But you had that drink with Manfred Lahnstein, the famous State Secretary with Helmut Schmidt, in a pub in Hamburg. And he said the whole point about joining the European monetary system, Dennis, is that the Italians and the French get a spend vast amounts of money to stop the D-mark from rising against them in the European monetary system. So you said, well, it doesn't sound like a very good idea for Britain to go into the European monetary system on those grounds. Well, what kind of relevance has that got, do you think, for today? Because the Germans are very lucky that they've got this situation where the D-mark doesn't have to rise.
They're lucky, yes, exactly. But whether we're lucky is another question. I think not.
Another hand. John, over there.
I'm John Tolson from the Ministry of Defence. You were Defence Secretary for a long time. You were a great advocate for the department. You got a lot of money out of the Treasury. Could you perhaps comment on how your perspective changed about the Ministry of Defence when you became Chancellor?
I didn't hear that properly.
You were a very successful Secretary of State for Defence at getting money out of the Treasury.
Yeah.
But when you became Chancellor, could you comment on how your perspective on your old department, the Ministry of Defence, changed?
Well, I think I understood their problems very well because I had my own experience, and that obviously influenced my attitude towards them, but I don't think I did them any damage.
You tried to stop the odd missile improvement programme, scheduling and things, and you had a go at that, if I remember.
Well, I was very uncertain whether it made sense. But one of the biggest questions in politics really relates to what is the real value of having nuclear weapons? If, you know, because a nuclear war is a world war is inconceivable so long as the big powers have nuclear weapons, and indeed war between India and Pakistan over Kashmir has become impossible because they've both got nuclear weapons. If they had nuclear weapons, they would certainly have been fighting one another. So that, oddly enough, nuclear weapons, as Winston Churchill forecast himself, surprisingly, have done a great deal to prevent war, and they've certainly prevented a world war. They haven't, of course, prevented civil wars, and civil wars often drag in the surrounding countries. But a world war is absolutely out of the question now.
Talking of war, you wouldn't have, what would you have done about Iraq?
Pardon?
Iraq.
Well, I personally was very much against intervention in Iraq, and I wrote an article for The Independent 2 years before we did go in, forecasting the result that would turn the whole of the Muslim world against us. We'd increase the amount of terrorism in the world, and that proved to be the case.
Over here.
Michael Lafferty, co-chairman of UNFIT. Lord Healey, how do you feel about what's happened to Ireland, to the Irish economy, and how long do you think it will be before we will see a recovery in Ireland?
Well, as an Irishman, commenting on Irish politics is very, very difficult indeed. But I think that in spite of the fact that Gerry Adams has now come back into a very prominent position, the risk of another civil war has diminished enormously. And a lot of that, I think, was due to our own, my own decision actually, to abolish the B specials. Indeed, surprisingly, I was once walking down the river in Sligo, and a man rushed out of a bar and gave me an enormous bottle of Irish whiskey because of that, which I'm still supping.
Yes, Rosalie, right at the back.
Rosaline Hughes of Queen Mary. Can I ask you another question about the IMF in 1976? Even after the Cabinet had agreed that they would make cuts of 1 billion, Witteveen then came back and said he wanted 2 billion. And that was when, as the official minutes say, the Chancellor said Dr. Witteveen could take a running jump. After Witteveen had asked for 2 billion, did you really think there was a good chance that you might not get the IMF loan at all? And why do you think Witteveen changed his mind? Do you think that...
I didn't. I thought we'd get the loan as we did, and I was right. And I remember very well that Alan Whittam, who was negotiating for the IMF with me, had been sent over to the States, took my own view.
Yeah.
And as I said later on, I was offered the job of head of the IMF. So, Gomorrah, or Sodom, whichever.
Joe. Thank you.
Joe Barnett. Dennis, there's a question I've always wanted to ask you on taxation. You never had much to do with it. Me and Nigel down there who spent 5 years day and night, literally night, on finance bills, which we never took part in. But I wondered if you ever regretted the phrase, you had many phrases, famous ones, and the one about making the pip squeak when you increased the top rate of tax, which I had to take through, of course, because we didn't bother this. 98% for investment income. Do you ever regret
the phrase used just after the First World War by the Chancellor at that time? It wasn't a phrase of mine at all.
You used it though.
Oh yes,
Well,
well,
you want
that
to
quote
use
other
it.
people's.
Use a different quote. I
Oh,
mean, I did some research here, may I read it out? This is a quote from this. I warn you, there are going to be howls of anguish from 80,000 rich people who are rich enough to pay over 75% on the last slice of their income, but there was no reference to the pip squeak.
That's right, yes.
Is the Party Conference 73, is it?
Well,
Party Conference 73? Is
Yeah,
that right? You said that?
yes.
I said
I
that.
think so.
Yes, it was, yes.
Well, do you regret saying that, Dennis?
No. I didn't say it.
No, I know you didn't say that. And then you...
Bill Martin, when you were Chancellor, Dennis, you had to get the permission of the Prime Minister if you wanted to put up interest rates.
Yes.
These days, of course, all that's done by the Bank of England. Was independence of the Bank of England ever thought of as a policy measure in your time as Chancellor? And had it been made independent, do you think it would have made any difference?
I personally think it was a good idea to do it. But in my time, we had at the Treasury, the Bank of England really had to get out of agreement if they wanted to change interest rates. But I personally think it would have been better to leave it. What difference it would have made in our particular case, I really don't remember it enough to guess.
Yes, we have Brian Unwin here. We have Brian Unwin here, who was with you. I wonder whether...
Oh yes, hello.
The budget, I'm thinking of the budget that never was.
Yes. Brian Unwin, I spent some time in the Treasury. I drafted one or two of your budget speeches, including the one you never made in March '79 because of the election. I just wondered, getting back to your role as Chancellor, what did you think of all the mumbo-jumbo that goes with the great budget speech and the ritual? I mean, it's very convenient to us in the Treasury, because you were, I mean, tiresome spending departments were told, sorry, we can't talk about that, that's the Chancellor's business. But it was really a bit of nonsense. But what did you think yourself of that whole ritual?
I think myself, the French have an expression which suits very well. Mère de bœuf. Or bullshit, if you want.
On that subject of being Chancellor, what surprised you most when you got to the Treasury? I remember asking Lord Lawson, who was also here,
Yes.
what surprised him most about the Treasury, having written about it for so long, and it was that the degree to which it was, control of public spending that took up so much time.
Well, I inherited a terrible, I was told that by the press at that time, the Economist and others, that Terry Bald had left me a poisonous legacy that it was impossible to deal with. But I did in fact manage to deal with it. The press, I think, the FT has always been, in my view, very good in dealing with all these problems. But I think a lot of the press was absolutely dreadful, and of course had no idea whatever of economics, people who wrote the leaders.
Nigel Wilson was both a journalist and then a chancellor. I think that's unique, really, isn't it? Do you want to comment on that remark? Machine coming?
I'm very happy listening to Dennis reminiscing and remembering all the things he got right, forgetting all the and conveniently forgetting all the things he got wrong.
Another hand, yes, right at the back, Alan.
Thank you. Alan Evans, currently attached to the Cabinet Office. Back to '76 and the IMF crisis, you famously turned back from the airport to go to the Labour Party conference. Do you ever have second thoughts about whether that was the right thing to do, and did you ever have doubts at the time that you were doing the right thing?
I think I was absolutely right to go to the party conference because keeping the Labour Party from not opposing you, I won't say necessarily supporting you, that was often impossible, is very important indeed. And I think it was much more important to be there than to go to, I forget where it was, somewhere the other side of the world.
The Philippines.
Manila. Philippines.
Philippines. You were a bit rude about Jim's speech in '76 at the party conference after the event, Dennis. Do you remember? I don't know if Peter Jay's with us today. He often is, isn't he? And didn't you say it's not a good idea to get your son-in-law to write your speeches?
Yes, Peter Jay.
Yes. You disagreed with that patch of Jim's speech about we can no longer borrow our way out and all that.
Yes.
The repudiation of Keynes.
Yes.
Did you tell Jim at the time that you thought it was a mistake?
I did. I did. I mean, Jim actually was extremely good for me to work with. He understood the problems I had to deal with, and so, I mean, even on interest rates, where he once got the cabinet to oppose me, he sent a messenger around just after the cabinet meeting to say, "I'm terribly sorry, I think I made a terrible mistake. No, you can raise them." No, he was very, very helpful indeed, actually.
Bill Martin mentioned the Bank of England. You had good relations with Gordon Richardson.
Very, yes.
And Kit McMahon was in the audience.
What I call in my book, that we had a relationship of creative tension. But we got on very well with one another. We talked quite honestly and frankly about our views with one another. And but we didn't always come to an agreement, but we often did. And I found him a wonderful man to work with, and he became a friend for life. And I was very upset when he died.
Sir Ronnie McIntosh.
It's difficult. It's difficult for even for those who were there to remember just how much time and effort went on for nearly 2 decades was spent on incomes policy, which came to an end when your chancellorship came to an end. Do you think that that time and effort should have ceased sooner?
Well, I think the key thing, frankly, that made incomes policy no matter was the introduction of one man, one vote, which John Smith did into the unions, and Maggie Thatcher continued when she took over. Because once the whole of the union membership had the ability to determine what happened, rather than union barons like Scanlon and Jack Jones, who could reverse policy the moment they took over without consulting the membership, the unions have not been a problem since then.
Talking of incomes policy in unions, we have Dr. Androsch here, who was Finance Minister of Austria, and didn't you rather admire the way the unions were handled, and incomes policy was handled there?
Yes, I did.
Do you want to say anything, Dr.?
Pardon?
You expect a question and an answer. I wonder, we were in the lucky situation that I could, to some extent, in opposition to what the Prime Minister expected, pursue, because I had the full support by the trade union movement.
Yeah.
What then was called a sort of hard currency policy that's linking the currency of our small economy to the Dutch mark, would not have worked without the support of the trade union movement and their reaction in a moderate wage policy. And what we could do in infrastructure and educational investment was to provide full employment, even under the difficult years since 73, 74 up to the 80s. But it was not a recipe. When Mitterrand came into power in 81, I think it was, he tried to follow suit, and it didn't work.
Mitterrand.
Mitterrand,
Mitterrand, 81.
yes.
Yeah. Only 87, when De La Rosière became governor of the Bank of France, in a certain way, but of course adjusted to the circumstances of the time and of the country, his own country, he succeeded in following or trying to follow the Dutch mark path. So there's no recipe. Each country has to try to find its own, so to say, trail.
No, I mean, I think one of our biggest problems really in Britain until one man, one vote was introduced was the power of the union barons, who could reverse the union policy the moment they took office, as happened in the case with Scanlon when he took over from Terry Duffy, for example. And that problem was a terribly difficult one for us, and it wasn't until Smith introduced one man, one vote, and Maggie continued it, that the union problem has not existed since then.
Please, yes. Do you want to wait for the microphone?
Thanks, Tom Clark from the Guardian. The current government, like yours, is having to, or decided to, retrench very dramatically. First of all, I wondered what you thought about its decision to do so. I know you've said it's all very uncertain, but is it like to make things better or worse? And secondly, on your own record, I wonder why, like the current government, you, when the time came to tighten things, went for big spending cuts rather than tax rises.
I didn't hear that properly.
It's a comparison with today, when you had to retrench, when you had to cut public expenditure in 76, why did you do that rather than go for tax rises? When you cut public expenditure quite heavily?
Oh, well, because I
Effectively.
thought that we would lose more votes by increasing tax. That's not a lunatic.
Dennis, we've got a lot of Labour veterans of different vintages here, indeed current Labour as well as original Labour, as Jim Callaghan used to call it. You once said at an academic occasion, I think, the problem with the party you love, Labour Party, is that once it had implemented the Beveridge Report by 1951, it ran out of things that everybody agreed on. And this was your explanation for the kind of perpetual possibility of civil war inside the Labour Party. Do you remember saying that?
I think I do,
Yeah. Do you still think that holds? Is there a lurking danger of civil war inside your old party? Or your party?
Well, I think, again, I think it was very largely a result of the fact that the union leaders could be won over without them consulting their members. And so it was the splits inside the Labour Party were often the result of splits inside the trade union movement or in individual trade unions. And it wasn't until we got one man, one vote introduced that we got rid of that. There's been no problem since with the unions.
But you had a huge ideological divide inside Jim's cabinet when you look at the range of views and people in it. I mean, it wasn't just the trade unions. When you look at the spectrum of opinion from Tony Benn to, well, David, if he doesn't mind me saying so, inside Jim's cabinet, it was huge, wasn't it? David might, there's a cue for David to come in. a rather unsubtle one, but it was there. Microphone? Thank you.
I think Jim handled that differences very well. And, you know, the IMF negotiations he exhausted the cabinet. And when a controversial issue came, he never cut Tony Benn out. He always allowed him to speak. There was one wonderful moment when Dennis was speaking, and he saw Tony Benn scribbling away, and he turned to Tony Benn and he said, "Tony, do you want me to speak a little slower?"
For the diary.
It was a good-natured character.
But on the public spending question, one of your problems was that those measurements, before you got Leo Gliatsky in, at one stage the figures, the Treasury was suggesting that public spending was 60% of GNP, whereas in fact it was 45.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a bit of an influence.
I think, as I say, one of the great problems we had in my period was the inaccuracy of the figures with which we had to deal. I mean, the PSBR figures were always enormously out. 2 billion too low, too high 2 years, and 1 billion 2 years the following.
Because the markets wanted blood. I seem to remember in your memoirs you said at one stage, some medical examination, they couldn't get any blood out of you.
Yes, I think that's true.
The Treasury's had a bit of a hammering, actually. I don't know if Nick wants to get up and defend. Perhaps you don't.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think they work well.
Isn't it your Nick? Yes.
Yeah, they're so good.
Yes. There's another historian of the party called David here. David Miliband, do you want to comment on the grand sweep of Labour history that Dennis encompasses? And ask a question.
Those of us who lose leadership elections are probably not in the best position to write the history of it, because I think it's the victors who write the history. Dennis, I think one interesting thought is that the last two governments, the Blair-Brown government lasted 13 years, and then the Thatcher-Major governments lasted 18 years. When you came into politics in the 60s and 70s, it seemed much more like a pendulum politics. And one thought that makes those of us in my party feel optimistic at the moment is that we might be in a 1970-74 situation rather than in a 1979 or a 1997 situation. It's what leads some of us to seek to lead the party. And I wonder if you can see parallels between the Heath government of 1970 and the Cameron government of today, and whether you think there is a fighting chance that this period we're going into might be one where there are shorter-lived governments rather than long sweep governments. Just one coda to that. Sorry, just one coda to it.
Well, I don't follow things so closely now, but I think you're right. It is possible.
just to maybe draw you out on one aspect of it. For the last 20 or 30 years, the Liberals have had 15, 20, 25% of the vote. And the Alliance, obviously, in the 80s to got boosted that. We may now be going. Do you think we're going into a period where the Centre Party vote is actually going to fall, and it'll become much clearer Labour-Tory fight?
I didn't quite get the last point.
David was saying, do you think that the Liberal Democrats may come down in their share of the vote? Because they've had a historically high share of the vote.
What I personally think is that the coalition will break down within 12 months from now, because the rank and file Liberals will not support their party being in with the Tories. I think that's going to happen myself.
Hands, yes, right at the back. Thank you.
Ben Draper, I'm a lowly student at Queen Mary. Being a man of sort of old Labour traditions, if you excuse the term, do you feel any nostalgia for the sort of older type of politics that tended to be forward in the 60s, 70s, that kind of expired in the 70s, as opposed to the more sort of mixed, possibly coalition-led, if we're to believe Nick Clegg, politics of today? Do you see any nostalgia?
Are you nostalgic for the old politics, Dennis, the one you grew up in, rather than the more volatile, multi-party politics of today?
Oh, no, I'm very much against nostalgia. To me, it's a vice. I think the important thing about British politics is that the class divisions, which were very, very real and strongly felt, have almost completely disappeared. And that, of course, has led to very much lower voting. Fewer people bother to vote than they used to. But the thing is that in my time, the Labour Party members wore cloth caps, Tories wore bowlers, and of course the Lords wore top hats. But that has all changed completely now, and if you ask people what class they belong to, they say, I left school years ago.
Dennis, I think you should have reminded the last questioner that actually in your time you were one of the modernisers. It was your speech at a party conference against nationalisation as a way of defining the Labour Party, which was one of the big moments in the modernisers' efforts to change the party. You weren't successful, it's true, but you certainly were a moderniser.
I think, now that is actually, sorry Giles, that is basically true.
Do you want to elaborate a bit?
Pardon?
About being a moderniser in your own time.
Well, I think the big problem about modernising parties now, as I say, is that the class divisions have gone. The disagreements between the parties on domestic policy have almost disappeared. The disagreements now inside the parties rather than between the parties. And that's equally true of foreign policy, but it's been true of foreign policy for a very long time. So the party system itself is not really working the way it used to. And that's one reason why, of course, the number of people bothering to vote has fallen very, very dramatically in the last 20 years.
There's this very interesting, everyone's been very polite here, and nobody has mentioned the winter of discontent, 78-9. As you as Chancellor, were you hoping that Jim would call an election in the October 78?
I did think so, yes. I think he would have done better to do that. He made a mistake to carry on. In fact, I wrote that in my book.
And we've talked about your relations with Jim. Now, Harold Wilson was Prime Minister both under Defence, but also the early part of your chancellorship.
Yes.
And how did that go? Was that an easy relationship?
Well, Wilson was like Macmillan, he was a total opportunist. He could shift his policy from day to day according to what he felt would be politically helpful. And he was a difficult person to work for that reason. But fortunately, he didn't take much interest in defence. So I was very lucky in a way in being more or less allowed to decide defence policy on my own.
You said in your book that he had told you several years before of his intention to resign, because there was a great conspiracy theory, wasn't there, in '76?
Yeah.
But he told you several years before.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, I think it's nearly drinks time. Just a quick one, yes?
Yes, David Marsh. If the election had if it had taken place in 1978, and if Labour had won, the next Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer probably would have been David Owen. Would David Owen have been a better Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer than Gordon Brown?
What a rude question.
I thought Gordon was a very good Chancellor indeed, actually. Very much better as Chancellor than as Prime Minister.
Can I ask
I don't think David would have been as good as Gordon. I
don't think he's leaping to his feet. Can I finish, Dennis, with a big grand sweep question? Because when you came back after the war and worked in Transport House, you worked very closely with Ernie Bedding,
yeah.
Formation of NATO.
Yeah.
An extraordinarily fertile period for British foreign and defence policy. Did you ever think the Cold War would end in your lifetime, Dennis? Looking back to those extraordinary events, 47, 48.
I wouldn't say I took a strong view that it would never end, but I didn't see it ending at any particular time when I was active in politics. Yeah. And nobody foresaw Gorbachev, you see. That was the great thing in Russia or anywhere else. But he totally transformed the world.
Yeah. Well, we've had a hell of a good evening. Can I thank our partners in the college, the School of Economics and Finance, our esteemed sponsors, Hewlett Packard, and our new friends at Babcock International, who make all these evenings possible between them. But above all, before we go for drinks downstairs, I want to thank you, Dennis, for coming and being so fascinating and such a good friend to the scholars we send to interview you from time to time. Thank you.